The frost took her last boy that winter. Elijah Connors buried his son beneath a frozen fence post, the earth too rigid to take a proper hole. The prairie wind howled around him as he stood alone with the shovel in his hands, jaw clenched until his teeth ached. No prayers, no cross, just a pile of stones over the small body that had coughed itself quiet in the dark. His wife had gone the year before, bled out slow in childbirth while he fetched the midwife who never came. He built the pine box himself and lowered it into the ground behind the barn, his hands slick with her blood drying under his fingernails. That was the last time he cried. The ranch had once stretched green and wild under summer skies, wheat brushing his knees, cattle strong and fat. Now it was dust, bones, and half-starved heifers. Elijah worked the land out of habit more than hope, days melting into one another like mud on the sole of his boot. The townsfolk had stopped coming by. He stopped asking them to. So when he saw the wagon coming down the ridge that spring, he thought it a mirage. It was a rickety thing, one wheel groaning under the weight. A mule pulled it, ribs sharp as fence rails. Inside sat a woman with her hair bound in a kerchief stained the color of dried roses. 3 children clung to her, triplets by the look of them, though no 2 faces matched. One had hair the color of tarnished silver, another so dark it shimmered blue in the light, and the third, a redhead with a bruise beneath his eye like a thumbprint pressed too hard. Elijah didn't move from the porch until they stopped at the edge of his field, where the wagon buckled and tilted in surrender. He walked down slow, like a man approaching a snake too tired to bite. "She didn't speak first. He did. You lost." She climbed down like her bones might crack, her knees shaking under her skirt. The triplets stayed behind, eyes watching from the shadows like feral things. "No," she said, her voice was hoarse, rubbed raw by wind and worry. "I was told this land wasn't being worked proper, that you might could use hands." Elijah took her in then. She was lean but not young. There was steel in the way she stood, even if her boots were caked in road filth and one sleeve hung by a few stubborn stitches. Her face was tired, too tired for lies. "And who told you that?" "Feller in town, said you were the widower on the ridge. Figured maybe you needed saving more than we did." The mule collapsed behind her. One of the children whimpered. He looked past her to the wagon, to the wild stare of the oldest boy, the hollow cheeks of the girl. "I've got a loft," he said. "It's warm most nights, got stew, not much meat." The woman nodded once, slow. "That'll do." She didn't tell him her name until 2 days later. They settled in like smoke. The triplets didn't talk, not even to each other. They clung to silence the way starved things clung to food. Elijah found them standing at his window in the early dawn, unmoving, their reflections soft as ghosts in the pane. The woman worked. She didn't ask what needed doing, she saw it. She mended the broken fence, oiled the hinges of the barn door, mucked stalls without a word. When Elijah tried to thank her, she just looked at him like he'd spoken nonsense. "Name's Ruth," she said finally, over a pot of beans she'd stretched to feed 5. "Boys are Micah, Isaac, and Junie." "They don't look much alike," Elijah offered. "Not supposed to," she said, and that was all. For weeks they lived like this. Elijah kept expecting them to leave. He had nothing to give them but space and cold bread, yet Ruth stayed. She worked beside him without complaint, her hands blistered but steady. The children followed her like shadows, their silence heavy but not cruel. Then came the fire. It started in the eastern pasture, where Elijah hadn't walked in weeks. The wind carried it fast, orange tongues licking the sky. Ruth saw it first, screamed once, a sharp, urgent sound that pierced the quiet. They ran, buckets, blankets, anything they could find. The children formed a line without being told. Junie slipped once and came up with soot on his face, but didn't cry. Isaac poured until his arms shook. Micah stood by the barn, eyes fixed on the flames, unmoving until Elijah dragged him back. They lost half the field, but the barn stood. The house, too. Ruth didn't speak for hours after, just sat with her back against the well, dirt streaked down her face like war paint. That night, Elijah found her in the yard, eyes turned up to the stars. "You saved the place," he said. "No," she answered, voice thin. "You did. We just didn't let you burn with it." And for the first time in 3 years, Elijah Connors laughed. It was dry, broken at the edges, but real. "You got nowhere else to go." She shook her head. "Nowhere that have us." "Then stay." It wasn't a command or a plea, just a fact laid down between them like a plank of wood. She looked at him. He couldn't read her face. "All right," she said, "we will." The triplets were watching from the window again, but this time they weren't afraid. They were waiting. And Elijah, standing in the ashes of the eastern field, felt something shift in his ribs. Not joy, not yet, but something close enough to make him breathe easier. Something alive. By midsummer, the house no longer felt hollow. Ruth didn't try to fix what was broken in Elijah, and that's what made her dangerous to the quiet he'd built around himself. She didn't speak unless the words were needed, didn't coddle, didn't pity. She moved like someone who had crawled out of worse places and carried the shape of them inside her. The triplets began to stretch. Their skin took color again, their limbs filling out with strength like sap rising in trees. They still didn't talk much, but their silence softened. Isaac whittled animals from scrap wood and left them on windowsills. Junie dragged sticks through the dirt and mapped things he never named. Micah learned the land like it was a story he had to memorize or die trying. Elijah started waking before dawn again, not from nightmares, but to work. He found himself listening for their footsteps in the loft, for Ruth humming low as she boiled coffee over the stove. Something inside him, long dead and buried, stirred each time he heard it. The days spun on. Wheat came in yellow, wild and thick. The cattle gained weight. Elijah taught the boys how to dig post holes straight and clean. Ruth taught them how to shoot. He didn't ask how she knew. Late one afternoon, as the sun broke red over the field, Ruth showed up at the porch with a rifle. His rifle cleaned. "Why?" he asked. "In case they come back," she said. "Who?" She didn't answer, just handed him the gun and turned back toward the barn. That night he watched her sit with the triplets by the fire, telling them a story without words. They leaned against her like saplings against an old tree. Elijah sat at the edge of the room and felt the heat of something not entirely grief. In early August, a man came up the trail. Elijah spotted him from the ridge, too clean for a drifter, too slow for a lawman. When the man reached the gate, he didn't ask for water or shade. He looked at Elijah the way a crow might look at a carcass. "You're the one took in Ruth Walker," the man said. His voice was smooth, slick with certainty. "That's her name, ain't it?" Elijah didn't answer. "She got something of mine, something she ran with." "What was that?" "My boys." From the porch, Elijah heard a chair scrape. Ruth had stepped outside. Her eyes were on the man, but her hand was on her hip, not resting, waiting. "You lost your claim when you broke their bones," she said low. The man spat near the dust. "They weren't mine by blood, but they were mine. That's what mattered. You run, Ruthie, but you can't stay hidden forever." "They ain't hiding," Elijah said. His voice had flint in it now. "And you ain't welcome here." The man laughed. It was not a sound of joy. "I'll be back, and I'll bring what's owed me." He turned and walked slow, the way men do when they believe they still hold power. That night Ruth told Elijah the rest. She'd been kept in a church-turned camp in Missouri, a haven that turned to rot when men like Clay Hargreaves took over. He'd called himself preacher, judge, and father to dozens. The triplets were born to different women, all of them gone now. Ruth took the boys when the fire started, though she never admitted to lighting it. "They weren't gonna make it," she said, staring into the coals. I couldn't let them rot in that place. They're yours, as much as they're anyone's. He watched the flames leap in her eyes. You're not scared of him, he said. No. He nodded, neither was he. They spent the next week fortifying the ranch. Fences repaired, traps set, rifle oiled and ready. Ruth moved like she'd prepared for this her whole life. Elijah followed, not questioning her choices. The triplets helped too, with a quiet focus no child should have had. The man returned on a Sunday. Not alone. 5 others rode with him, faces smeared with road dust, guns slung too casual. They stopped at the edge of the property and dismounted. Elijah stepped out first, rifle in hand. Ruth stood beside him, a pistol at her hip. We come for what's owed, Clay called. Give us the boys and we'll go. You ain't leaving either way, Elijah said. The standoff lasted less than a minute. A crow cried overhead, sharp and sudden. Then Ruth fired. The first man went down with a scream. Elijah took the second with a clean shot through the chest. One of the others turned and ran, hit the wire trap by the gate and went down hard. The rest scattered. Clay stayed standing, eyes wide, with a kind of rage that had no logic. He stared at Ruth like she'd betrayed the world just by breathing. You think this changes anything, he shouted. You think you're safe now. Ruth stepped forward, slow, calm. I know I am. She fired once. Clay's legs buckled. He fell to his knees. You should have burned, he said, choking. She looked at him like she was seeing something already dead. I did. Then he was gone. They buried the bodies far from the house. Ruth said no words. The children watched, solemn and still. That night, Elijah sat with her under the porch lantern. You knew they'd come. I always knew. You ever gonna run again? She shook her head. Not while you're here. He didn't ask what that meant, not fully, but something in his chest unlocked. The next morning, Ruth woke first, and Elijah heard her humming again. This time, he hummed with her. By the time the frost came again, the land had learned them. The boys walked taller, carried themselves with a new weight. Micah grew into his silence like a shield. Isaac's hands never stopped moving. He carved, built, repaired. Junie talked to the horses as if they answered him, and maybe they did. Ruth no longer looked like a woman passing through. Her eyes tracked the horizon less, her jaw unclenched. She moved slower, with the rhythm of someone no longer waiting to be hunted. She took over the ledger without asking, tracked feed and supplies, and rewired the barn lanterns with steady fingers. Elijah found himself listening for her footsteps now, a second heartbeat in the house. He caught himself watching her when she read at night, mouthing the words like they were spells she didn't trust out loud. He'd wake sometimes from dreams not filled with loss, but with the sound of her laughter, not loud, just sharp and rare, like wind snapping the edge of a canvas sail. She only laughed when the boys argued. They fought in bursts, short, cruel, and without malice. Elijah didn't interfere. Ruth handled them with a glance, a word, a single command. Sometimes she'd kneel between them and speak low, her voice heavy with something earned. They always listened. One evening they brought home a stray, a girl, maybe 11, hiding under the broken bridge east of the pasture. Isaac had spotted her first. She had a rusted knife and eyes like a cornered bobcat. She's got nowhere, Junie had said, quiet. Same as we did. They brought her in. Ruth didn't ask her name for 3 days. When she gave it with teeth. Clem, she said, not short for nothing. Ruth nodded. All right, Clem, you eat, you work, you stay out of the boys' quarters. Clem nodded back. They understood each other. Elijah watched as the house grew fuller. The kitchen louder, boots by the door, bread rising in the oven, the ache in his bones lessened, not gone but thinned. And then came the letter. A man in town brought it, unsure whether to hand it over. "Says Elijah Connors," the man said, "but the seal's government, East." Elijah opened it slow, read each word twice. "You served," Ruth said later, watching him from across the table. "Long time ago. You got called." "No, not like that." It was a summons of sorts. A brother he hadn't seen in 15 years was dead, and the land back east, their father's, was now his by blood, but it came with strings, tax debt, a courthouse appearance, legal documents he couldn't sign by candlelight. "They want me to come back, settle it, or lose the claim." "You going?" "I don't want the land." Ruth tilted her head. "But you're thinking about going." "I don't know why, maybe to say goodbye to something." She didn't speak for a long time. "I've always been good at leaving things behind," she said, "not so good at knowing when not to." He didn't ask her to come, but she packed a bag anyway. Elijah took the train east with Ruth and Clem, leaving the boys behind for the first time since they arrived. The ride was long, stretched out over miles of rust-colored plains and shadowed woods. Clem pressed her face to the glass the whole time, drinking it in like she might forget if she blinked. Back east, everything stank of smoke and stone. The courthouse was a box of suits and dry ink. Elijah answered questions, signed forms, and took nothing. He let the land go to debt. It had never been his, not really. But before they left, he took them to the old house. It was boarded, forgotten. Ivy clawed up the sides. "My brother drank himself into the ground here," Elijah said, standing in the dead grass. "We used to trap foxes in the orchard. I buried my mother by the fence post when I was 17. Ruth didn't ask questions. Clem took his hand once, just for a second. They burned the house that night. Nothing dramatic, just slow fire, controlled and purposeful, a funeral of splinters and ash. Elijah watched it fall with a calm he hadn't known he needed. When they returned west, the boys were waiting by the gate. Micah had grown taller in 3 weeks. Isaac had whittled a full chess set. Junie had painted something on the barn door, a crude image of a mule smiling. The ranch pulsed with breath again. Winter came harsher than expected. Coyotes took 2 calves, ice cracked the well. Ruth got sick once, deep in her chest. Elijah sat beside her bed with a cloth and read from the tattered psalms she kept under her pillow. "I didn't think you were the praying type," she whispered. "I'm not," he said, "but your fever listens better than you do." She smiled, faint. Her hand found his. It took her 9 days to stand again. When she did, the snow began to melt. And for the first time in 4 years, Elijah carved a new fence line. Not because he had to, but because he wanted more room for what was coming. Spring came early and hard, cracking the frost like glass and sending water rushing through every low ditch and dry bed. The ranch swelled with green. Birds returned. Shoots of wild barley pushed up through the black soil near the eastern field, land that had once burned, now breathing again. They built more than they meant to, 2 new sheds, a tack house, a smoke pit. Ruth planted herbs along the path between the barn and the house, things she said would keep the flies off meat and the sickness out of lungs. Micah started helping Elijah with the cattle, quiet and methodical. Isaac took to Clem like a brother, showed her how to trap squirrels and keep the blades sharp. Junie built a scarecrow without being asked and named it Reverend Thistle. It didn't feel like a family, not exactly. More like a knot of survivors learning the shape of each other's shadows. They knew how to leave space when silence needed room and when to close in around a storm. The storm came again in June. It began with a rider, not Hargreaves this time. He was long buried in the far pasture where the buzzards wouldn't go. This one came wearing a gold badge and a preacher's tongue. His horse was clean. His teeth were cleaner. Elijah Connors, he said, tipping his hat like it meant something. I'm Marshal Ryland. I need a word with your missus. She ain't my missus, Elijah replied. That's so. Ryland looked past him, at Ruth who stood behind the screen door, rifle leaning on her hip like a third arm. Then I need a word with Ruth Walker, or whatever name she's taken since. Elijah didn't move. She's not talking to you. Fugitive warrant came down from Jefferson County. Old papers, real official. Ryland's smile was tight. I don't make the law, I just drag it behind me. Those boys, Ryland said louder, his voice cutting like steel. They ain't hers by blood, that makes them state property. The porch boards groaned beneath. Elijah's stepped forward. This land is mine. You're standing on it, uninvited. Ryland's eyes darkened. You plan to make trouble. I'm done planning, Elijah said. You need to leave. That night Ruth didn't say a word. She just sat at the kitchen table, turning a coin between her fingers. Elijah watched her, watched the coin, watched the way the boys stood in the hall without breathing. He'll be back, she said. I know. I should go, she added, voice dull. You leave, they'll come anyway, with warrants or chains. She didn't argue, but she didn't agree. Instead, she went to the barn and taught Clem how to fire a shotgun from her shoulder. For the next week they lived like rabbits in a thicket, still, alert, tense. Every crunch of gravel brought eyes to the window. They took turns watching the ridge. At night, Elijah pulled the old rifle apart and cleaned it piece by piece until it gleamed. The second time Ryland came, he brought 3 men with him and a paper signed by a judge who'd never met any of them. Ruth stood on the porch, no rifle, no fight. Elijah felt his stomach hollow. I'll go, she said to Ryland, if you leave the children. Not how it works, Ryland said, grinning. They're state property. Clem stepped forward, eyes sharp. Isaac followed. Then Junie, holding a match in one hand, slow and steady. Micah came last, silent but sure. You're not taking her, Clem said. You'll die first. The men laughed. Then Elijah raised his rifle. It wasn't shaking. You want her, you'll need a lot more paper, he said, and a lot more men. Ryland looked at him, looked at the boys, looked at the line that had been drawn without any words. He spit into the dust. This ain't over. Most things worth keeping never are, Ruth said. They didn't sleep that night. Ruth sat at the table, arms crossed, shoulders rigid. Elijah paced. The boys cleaned the guns again. Clem built snares around the henhouse. At dawn, a wagon rolled in from town. Mrs. Albright, the midwife who'd stopped speaking to Elijah after his wife died, climbed down. She brought a tin of biscuits and a folded paper. We heard there was trouble, she said. I didn't send for anyone, Elijah replied. No, she said, but that boy of yours left carvings all over town, tiny animals, hawks, mules, and every one of 'em had a name scratched on the bottom. She handed him the paper. That's your petition. Half the county signed it. Ruth stared at the page, her mouth parting slightly. They can't take what's protected, Albright said, not when people start remembering who's worth keeping. Elijah didn't know what to say. You made this place something, Albright added. Don't let them burn it because they don't understand it. After she left, Ruth went outside and lit a fire in the pit. She burned the letter Ryland left behind. She burned the old church hymn book, too. That night the stars came out. Elijah sat beside her on the porch. You still want to leave? He asked. No, she said, but I wouldn't have stayed if you hadn't let me fight." He nodded. "And you?" she asked. "I don't know," he said. "All I ever wanted was quiet." She looked out at the pasture where the triplets were chasing Clem with handfuls of clover. "You still have it," she said. "It just sounds different now." Summer turned hot and mean that year, the kind that cracked lips and warped fence rails. The wind went dry and stiff as burlap, sweeping grit through the floorboards and rustling the wheat into a whisper Elijah could never quite translate. He stood most mornings before the sun, out by the gate, watching the hills. Not for riders, not anymore, just watching. Like if he stared long enough, he might see where it all began. Inside, the house was louder now. Laughter came in short bursts, not every day, but enough that it no longer startled him. Clem had taken to sleeping with a knife under her pillow, but she smiled with her whole face when she watched the goats play. Junie built a windmill out of wagon scraps that caught just enough air to turn in slow circles. Isaac planted corn along the west line without permission. Micah built a smokehouse and shot a buck before the season even started. One evening Ruth found a snake under the porch. She didn't scream, she didn't fetch Elijah. She caught it barehanded, cut its head off with a hatchet, and skinned it before dinner. They ate it with cornbread and beans. No one said a word. After the meal, Elijah lingered in the yard. Ruth came out beside him, a mug of coffee in her hands, though the air was still hot. "I don't know how this ends," he said. "It doesn't," she replied. "Not really, not for people like us." He looked at her then, really looked. She wasn't the same woman who'd climbed off a broken wagon with 3 half-dead boys and a mule ready to drop. There was more weight to her now, not heaviness, density. She was rooted. If someone tried to dig her up, they'd hit stone. "I think I'm tired of surviving," Elijah said. "I want something else." Ruth nodded once, then take it. It wasn't a promise or a bargain, it was just what it was. A fact between them, like fence posts, like dusk, like scars. The triplets grew into men that summer. Not all at once, but with that subtle, sudden shift only a parent sees. Their voices cracked, their hands calloused. They no longer needed instruction, they just asked for the tools. Clem cut her hair with a field knife and began dressing in old cavalry boots Ruth found at the trading post. When the merchant tried to charge her double, Clem took the boots and left 2 carved rabbits on the counter. He didn't chase her. In late August, Ryland came back. Not with men, not with guns. Alone. He rode to the gate, got off his horse, and stood in the heat like it might scald him. "I'm not here for trouble," he said. Elijah met him with the rifle slung across his shoulder, but didn't raise it. "Then speak fast." Ryland pulled a piece of paper from his vest. Charges dropped. Word came down from the Capitol. Seems someone high up didn't want their name tied to the old Walker case. Too many burned records, too many dead. "And the boys?" Elijah asked. "They're not listed anywhere. No proof of origin, no claim of custody. Hell, far as the state's concerned, they don't exist." Ruth stepped out of the barn then, wiping her hands on a rag. Ryland saw her and flinched, not from fear, but from recognition. Like she reminded him of something he once believed in and buried under duty. "I came to say it's over," he said. Ruth stared at him. "Nothing's ever over, it just gets quieter." Ryland nodded, mounted his horse, and left without another word. That night they butchered a pig and roasted it over coals. Ruth brought out an old bottle of corn whiskey. They passed it slow, mouths burning. The stars blinked low and wide, like embers in a black sea. After the children were asleep, Elijah sat by the fire with Ruth. Neither of them said much. The fire did the talking, crackling and shifting like old wounds closing. "I've got a spare key," he said after a long silence. Ruth didn't look at him. "To what?" "The room beside mine." She was quiet a moment. Then, "That door doesn't lock." "I know." And she nodded. Later, when the moon was high and the fire just coals, she followed him inside. Years passed, and the land changed again. The windmill Junie built pumped water steady through dry months. Micah ran cattle through 3 counties and never lost a head. Isaac's hands turned wood into things people paid for in gold coin. Clem kept the rifles clean and taught other girls how to shoot. Ruth never stopped moving. She built a root cellar, 2 new coops, and a library made from salvaged barnwood. She stitched a quilt with every name she'd ever wanted to forget and hung it over the mantel so they could look at it when they needed to remember. Elijah grew old without growing dull. His back bent, but his eyes stayed sharp. He walked the fence line every Sunday, rain or shine. When the neighbors came with disputes, they came to him. When their sons needed teaching, they sent them to Ruth. One autumn night, with frost curling under the doors and the scent of smoke in the rafters, Elijah sat on the porch and watched the house breathe. He listened to the quiet, the good kind, not the kind that devours you, the kind made from belonging. Ruth joined him. They didn't talk. The triplets sat in the barn with their own children. Clem rode back in from town with a pistol on her hip and a book under her arm. Dogs barked, goats bleated, the world spun on. Elijah closed his eyes and let it hold him. He had not been saved in the way men hope to be saved. No thunder, no angels, no promise of peace. But when the fire came to his door, he did not die in it. He was pulled from it, carried, barefoot and burned, into something better. And in the end, that was enough.